Chapter Soil and Sky Langley Estate, The Orchard. 6 weeks later, the wind rustled through the orchard where jasmine now bloomed beside new rows of plum and ash. Arabella stood in a long linen coat, hands deep in soil, sleeves rolled. Beside her, Dasha balanced a crate of seedlings, her face smudged with dirt and determination. "You really think all this will work?" Dasha asked, voice skeptical but not cynical. Arabella looked up. Everything that ever mattered started with a maybe. From the ridge above, Ashton watched them both. He held a notepad filled with budget projections and grant applications. But at that moment, he wasn't a strategist. He was just a man in awe. Behind him, Carver approached quietly, his limp more pronounced in the early frost. "Security check complete. Zurich facilities been gutted. Halebrook's accounts frozen. But ... double quotes. Ashton looked over. "But there's chatter again. Deep web. Some kind of reconstruction project codenamed Mother Seed Ashton's." Grip on the folder tightened. "Arabella needs to hear this," Carver said. "I know. Seen Langley Estate Library that evening? The fire burned low." Arabella stared at the words Mother Seed scrawled in River's encrypted handwriting. Decoded on the page, Ashton slid to her across the table. "They're trying to rebuild Bellatrix," Shay said flatly. "Not Bellatrix," Ashton said. "Something worse, cross-disciplinary, cybernetics, neural control. They're targeting orphans in war zones." Arabella closed her eyes. The fire cracked once. She whispered, "How many times do I have to kill this thing before it stays dead?" Ashton reached across. "We don't kill it, we outlive it, outshine it, outorganize it." She looked at him. "Then we don't fight alone this time." Chapter: The Many Rome Underground Survivor Symposium. 2 months later, the room smelled of wax and old paper. Survivors, whistleblowers, rogue scientists, ex-bodyguards, midwives, journalists, the many, they called themselves, gathered. Arabella took the floor. No more isolated battles. No more lone wolves. "This time we build a net so tight no girl falls through again." The days of silence are over. River arrived late. Sat in the back. Watched as Arabella didn't speak with fury, but with clarity, with direction, with something larger than herself. Later, as they packed up, he approached. "You've changed." Arabella smiled. "No, I've returned to who I was before they trained it out of me." River offered his hand. "Then let me join you, not to fight, but to rebuild." Montage. A new network, Langley HQ, becomes a public interest legal fortress. Ashton trains former Black Ops analysts to trace underground biotech contracts. Dasha leads outreach across Europe, building safe houses and tech literacy programs for rescued girls. River launches the Mirror Fund, giving digital tools to survivors to reclaim and monetize their own narratives. Carver forms a stealth task force to trace Mother Seed's financial arteries across the globe, and Arabella walks across borders, like a storm with roots carrying nothing but memory, purpose, and a velvet pouch still tucked in her coat. Chapter: The Return of the Architect Tokyo. A biotech summit, anonymous sponsors, tight security. But Arabella's face shows up on every encrypted screen in the lobby, and in a secured chamber above the summit. The architect watches, older, scarred, still alive, still plotting. A child sits beside her, eyes wide, pupils scanned. "A prototype. She's coming," says the man beside her. The architect smiles. "Let her." The train hummed low as it coasted through the southern valleys, its rhythm steady against the window pane where Arabella rested her hand. Dasha slept across from her, head tilted, a book still open on her lap. Outside, the hills rolled endlessly, shadowed in twilight. Arabella watched the horizon, quiet. She hadn't told Ashton she was leaving this time. Not because she doubted him, but because the work was faster now. Louder, more urgent. With every name unearthed from the Zurich archives, every whisper from the underground networks, another child was traced. Another facility exposed. Another thread pulled from the legacy Edward had tried to bury. River called it the Quiet Revolution. Carver called it war by other means. Arabella called it breathing. Her phone buzzed once. Ashton, a message. No questions, just 3 words. Still behind you. She closed her eyes, let her forehead rest against the glass. They'd lit fires across 3 continents now. The Bellatrix daughters no longer ghosts. No longer numbers had become voices, witnesses, warriors. Some returned to school, some became hackers. Some simply vanished into their own peace, choosing gardens over battlegrounds. Arabella never asked them to stay, but they all did. She still wore the ring. Not as a signal of ownership, but of return what Ashton had once called a vow made in the ashes. She hadn't taken it off since that night in the conservatory, where jasmine bloomed beside lavender and silence had finally softened. The train slowed. Somewhere outside Vienna, Dasha stirred. "Are we close?" Arabella nodded. "Next stop, then it's quiet. Then we listen." The target wasn't a facility this time, not a lab, not a server farm. It was a school, buried under false credentials and state sponsorships. It was another Fronta place where girls like her were being studied, conditioned, remade. But this time the walls would not hold. They arrived just before dawn. No weapons, no team. Just 2 women in gray coats, stepping off a train into the blue hush of a town not yet awake. Arabella led, her boots crunching frost. She remembered what it had felt like once. To be watched, every step catalogued, every emotion tested for control. Now it was her turn to watch, to name, to break the silence. The school loomed behind iron gates. Old stone, ivy-covered, deceptively innocent. Dasha's breath caught. "Same symbol as Zurich," she murmured. Arabella's voice was steady. "Then we're in the right place." They walked through the main gate. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. At the front desk, the woman looked up, mouth parting in recognition and fear. Arabella placed a folder on the counter, thick, stamped, sealed, inside court orders. Archival footage, a dozen testimonies, and 1 photo. The woman paled. "You can't be here." "I am," Arabella said. "And by the time we leave, neither will you." Authorities came within the hour. Not all of them clean, but the evidence spoke louder than any bribe. Arabella didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to be by nightfall. The school had been evacuated. Girls, dazed and blinking in the cold, were wrapped in blankets and ushered into vans sent from the Langley Trust. Arabella stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching them. She didn't smile. She simply exhaled another fracture-sealed dot, another ghost-free dot as they boarded the return train. Dasha finally asked, "Do you ever wonder what comes after this?" Arabella tilted her head. "After what? The fight? The missions? The war? If it ends, who are we then?" Arabella looked out the window, thought for a long time. "We plant," she said softly. "We build things that last. Homes, laws, gardens, and maybe someday, stories not written in fire." Dasha watched her eyes wide. "You really believe that?" Arabella turned. "I have, too." The train pulled away, lights trailing like comets in the dark. And far away, on another continent. The architect watched the footage from Vienna on her silent monitors. Her hands trembled not with rage, but with something older. Recognition. The storm she raised had not passed. It had learned to bloom. The days blurred after Vienna, each one layered with calls, field reports, quiet reunions, and louder reckonings. Arabella barely slept. But it wasn't exhaustion that wore at hurt, was velocity. The world was turning faster now, no longer. Spinning in denial, the trust had grown larger than she imagined. The truth wasn't a whisper anymore. It had become wind in Lagos. 3 ministers resigned after documents traced money from Bellatrix, shell accounts into academic scholarships that served as fronts for medical trials. In Buenos Aires, A warehouse fire revealed hundreds of discarded tech units used in early neural conditioning. In Brussels, a summit on bioethics had to halt proceedings after a Langley memo leaked. One Arabella had unsealed herself, showing the entire committee had once signed off on procurement of unclaimed subjects. And yet, the farther they reached, the more resistance they found. Some countries banned the archive. Some branded the girls conspirators. Some painted Ashton as a traitor to old wealth. Even Rivers' face was printed in tabloids now, distorted, weaponized, rewritten. The war hadn't ended. It had only changed form. Arabella knew it would. She never expected peace, only clarity. One morning, she sat in the solarium of the Langley estate. A pot of mint tea cooling beside her, fingers absently tracing the edge of an old photograph. Her at 17, unaware, wide-eyed on the threshold of becoming someone else's experiment. She didn't look angry. That almost hurt more. Her phone vibrated. One message. Ashton, the Crownwell files came in. France, not just Zurich. The last lab was moved under a biotech firm 2 years ago. The clerk owns it. Quietly, she didn't reply. Just stood, slipped on her coat, and walked to the archive room, where her team was already awake. Hope scrolling code, Sloan on a call with Interpol, Jin editing a survivor testimony that would air tonight. When she entered, they all looked. Up, they didn't salute. They didn't freeze. They nodded to her presence, no longer startled. It steadied. We're moving again, she said, handing the file to Hope. And this time, we don't go in silent. That afternoon, she boarded a private train headed toward the south of France. Carver met her halfway through the ride, briefing her on security, confirming the architect hadn't been seen in weeks. No footprints, no signals. But Arabella felt her in every shadow. She always did at the facility in Avignon. Under the guise of regenerative medicine, a second generation of tests had begun. Only this time, they weren't starting with girls. They were experimenting on memory itself, uploading, remapping, reconstructing trauma into false narratives. Healing, they called it. Reintegration, but Arabella had seen the early results. They weren't healing. They were rewriting, making survivors forget they were ever victims. She stood in the main control chamber, air thick with bleach and heat. The doctor who had greeted them was now silent in handcuffs. Behind her, tech swipe drives and packed evidence under Rivers. Supervision. Arabella stared at the central console. Helmet of silver spines. A monitor still playing a sessioner. Girl named Isla being asked to retell a memory. Only for the machine to inject edits mid-sentence. She blinked, rewound, complied. Arabella's jaw clenched. She reached forward and shut it down manually. When she turned, the room had gone quiet again. Later, on the rooftop above the compound, the wind picked up. Dasha joined her, now part of the leadership team. She lit a cigarette, frowned at it, then put it out without taking a drag. This doesn't end, does it? She asked. No, Arabella said. It evolves. Dasha looked at her. Then what are we building? Arabella glanced across the sea of hills and smoke, her voice almost lost in the wind. A memory that can't be rewritten. They returned to London that night. Rain fell soft, not storming, just present. In the Langley greenhouse, Ashton had left the lights on. She walked in slowly, shedding her coat by the door. He was repotting vines, sleeves rolled up, hair dusted with soil. She didn't speak. He didn't either, until she reached him. Until her hands covered his. Until the silence curled around them, like something earned. He turned. You're back for now. And later, we keep going. His fingers squeezed hers gently. Together. Arabella met his gaze. If the world burns again, I want you beside me with the water. Or the matches. His laugh was quiet. That's the closest thing to a proposal I've ever heard from you. She kissed him. Just once. Not for ceremony. For grounding. Outside, the world kept spinning. But inside the garden, something rooted deeper than memory had begun to grow, and it would not be moved by the end of the week. A handwritten envelope arrived at the estate no return address only, Arabella's name inked with deliberate strokes. She opened it alone, seated at her desk beneath the high library windows. The paper inside was textured, foreign, the handwriting unmistakable. You've burned my face from every archive. Clever. But legacy doesn't die with name tags. You were the prototype, but I have successors. They don't remember you, they don't need to. They're better, cleaner, loyal. You exposed my past, now I shape the future. See you in Marrakesh, eh? Arabella sat very still. She didn't flinch, didn't speak. Only folded the paper once and slid it into the fire. The embers flared orange, devouring the word "stop by midnight." She had called an emergency meeting in the Orchard office. Ashton sat to her right, River to her left. Dasha patched in via video, eyes sharp despite the late hour. They didn't need a long explanation. One line from her was enough. She started again. A low hum of tension rippled through the room. River leaned forward. She's replicating. Arabella nodded, but not me, not physically. She's done hiding behind clones. It's time she's building minds people who think her thoughts without memory of origin. New soldiers, Ashton murmured. Voice, grim no, Arabella corrected. New architects. A silence settled like dust before River finally spoke. So we go to Marrakesh. Arabella closed the file in front of her. We go quietly. No foundation tags. No press. If we surface this too fast, it disappears. Do we even know where? Ashton asked. I do, she said. And she did. The address was buried in an old file from Orpheus Diagnostics, masked as an arts collective. But Arabella remembered the symbol, the same one that had marked her first test room, a broken quill inside a circle. They landed at dawn. The air in Marrakesh was warm and dry, filled with the scent of oranges and iron. Arabella wore no black. This time, she moved through the crowd in linen and dust-colored shawls, blending in, eyes tracking every angle. The building was low and red-stoned, covered in murals. Students gathered near the steps. But deeper inside beneath the painted corridors was something else. A lab. Underground again? Always. Arabella waited until midnight to move. Inside, it was quieter than Zurich had ever been. Sleeker. No cryo chambers. No files. Just rows of terminals. And at the center, an interface humming with biometric scans and thought mapping code. A digital hive. And above it all, a sculpture of a woman faceless, made of wires and silk threads. A symbol. A warning. Arabella stepped forward, activated the central console. A hologram flickered to life. Not the architect, a girl, 15, maybe 16. And her voice was clear. If you're watching this, then she told you to come. That means she's ready for Phase 4. That means I'm obsolete. Arabella's blood turned to ice. The girl's voice continued. She calls me Unia, I think. That's a name she used to like. I don't remember much. But I remember one thing. I'm not a person. I'm a relay. A code carrier. If this message ends, that means she's already moved on. The image glitched. The girl blinked, confused, before vanishing. Arabella turned to River, her breath tight. She's using them as living decoys. Intelligence carriers. She plants these girls, lets them absorb the world, then wipes them clean once the data's retrieved. River swore under his breath. Where's the architect now? Ashton asked. Arabella turned toward the central wall of the lab where a digital map pulsed with recent server transfers. One node blinked steadily. Reykjavik.Arabella stared at it for a long moment. She's baiting us. Ashton said. She's running out of time, Arabella replied. Back in London, the trust team worked non-stop. Every file was cross-checked. Survivors brought in to verify whether any of the new identities matched girls they'd once known. So far, none. Whoever the architect was building now, they weren't clones. They were. Foundations, and Arabella understood. This wasn't about control anymore. It was about inheritance. 3 days later, she arrived in Reykjavik. The cold was sharp, the sky low. The facility was housed under a geothermal research institute, civil, sanitized, but behind reinforced glass. The newest project sat waiting, a child no older than 12, strapped to a neural halo. Dreaming, Arabella watched through. The glass. No electrodes. No wires. Just waves of memory being simulated, fed, rewritten, blank page, full script, and across the room. Standing at the control panel in a white coat, the architect, older now, scarred, one eye replaced entirely with obsidian tech. But her smile hadn't changed. When she saw Arabella, she didn't reach for security. She raised her hand. A greeting. Arabella entered the room without hesitation. No words passed at first. Just the hum of machines. Then, finally, the architect spoke. "Congratulations," she said. "You've come farther than any of my other versions." "I'm not your version," Arabella said. "Of course you are. Every woman who breaks their chains is still shaped by them. You just learn to turn the links into weapons." "I turn them into tools," Arabella corrected. "It's for building." The architect tilted her head, amused, still so earnest. "You're done," Arabella said. "Whatever this is, it ends tonight." "Oh, darling." "This isn't the end," the architect whispered, brushing a hand across the dreaming child's brow. "It's the blueprint. This one will never ask who she is. She won't need to. She'll be who we write her to be. Memory is overrated. Purpose is enough." Arabella stared at the child, so still, so small. Not a soldier, not a weapon. "Mirror, I used to think I was made in your image," Arabella said softly, "but I was made in spite of you." Then she reached into her coat and pulled the failsafe. River had designed it. Ashton had encrypted it. Hope had tested it in 6 labs across 3 countries. It would scrub every system. Not just data algorithmic memory, pattern code, real-time learning, and it would take the lab with it. The architect's eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't," she said. Arabella stepped forward, voice soft. "I'm not here to kill you. I'm here to bury what you made." Then she pressed the trigger. The glass began to melt. The power surged. And the fire began again. Not a fire of vengeance. A fire of erasure. By dawn, Arabella stood at the edge of the Icelandic cliffs, the sea boiling below. Behind her, Ashton approached. No words, just a thermos of coffee in his hand, held out like peace. She took it. They stood together, and this time she didn't look back. ChatGPT said they didn't speak for a long while. Just watched the steam curl from the thermos as the ocean wind thinned it into nothing. Arabella's fingers, wrapped around the warm metal, were steady now, not numb, not trembling, just still. Ashton stood beside her, coat fluttering in the cold, his expression unreadable but present, grounded. That was how he'd always looked when he wasn't performing, like gravity, not noise. "You're not going to ask me what happened," she said at last, the wind catching on the edge of her voice. "I already know," Ashton replied. "You came back." She nodded once, "And she's not coming back." That was all. No celebration, no relief. It's just the quiet understanding that the architect, the war, the old story, they were ash now. And Arabella was the one who had struck the match. She turned her gaze back to the sea, then slowly, almost absent-mindedly, pulled the ring on her finger free and looked at it. Not the decoy. Not the one forged for press releases or contract negotiations. The one she had chosen. Honest metal, smooth and simple. "I didn't think I'd survive it," she said, voice barely louder than the waves. "You did more than survive it," Ashton answered. "You rewrote it." She looked down at the ring again and then slipped it back on. Not like a woman retreating into safety, but like someone anchoring to her own name. Behind them, the first rays of sun broke the edge of the clouded horizon. casting pale gold light over the distant hills and water. The light didn't cleanse, it didn't forgive, but it revealed, and that, finally, was enough. When they returned to London, no announcement was made, no gala, no statement. Just a single internal memo circulated within the Langley Halebrook Trust. All remaining surveillance protocols discontinued, all identities restored, no daughters left behind. The girls, no longer the Bellatrix daughters, no longer subjects, began choosing names again. New ones, old ones. Some reclaimed their birth names, others made their own. Arabella didn't correct them. She only listened. She learned the shape of their silences. She remembered them all. The orchard bloomed early that year. Dasha began working full-time in the field office, setting up new intake programs for displaced girls across Eastern Europe. Sloane took a job with a legal coalition helping map out international reform on AI-based human rights violations. Jin taught self-defense classes in Brixton, refusing any press, but wearing her scars with unapologetic pride. And Arabella, she spent most mornings in the garden, hands in soil, growing things no one thought could root again. At night, she walked the halls of the estate barefoot, not haunted anymore, just present. She read again real books. She cooked when she couldn't sleep. Sometimes she stayed up and wrote, not for an audience, just to hear her voice again in ink. Ashton didn't ask for more than she gave. He was there planting trees with her in the orchard, meeting with donors, holding her hand when she let him, not building her life for her, just standing beside it. And slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, the rage quieted. Not gone. Never gone, but reshaped, forged into something cleaner. Power was no longer something she fought to escape. It was something she held now without flinching. Sometimes Arabella would look in the mirror and still see the versions they tried to make of her: the pawn, the bride, the failure, the storm, the reckoning. But now she simply nodded at them and let them pass, because she knew, finally, who she was without them. And on the first quiet night of spring, as Jasmine climbed the windows and the orchard whispered behind the stone walls, Arabella leaned into Ashton's shoulder, curled beneath a blanket, and let herself fall asleep, not in fear, not in armor, but in peace. Not the end, just breath. And Rootstock Arabella's days began earlier now. Not because of fear or urgency, but because dawn had become something sacred, an hour that belonged to no one else. In the quiet, just before light slipped through the conservatory windows, she moved barefoot through the dew-damp garden paths, Jasmine brushing her knees, Lavender brushing her palms. The orchard, once overgrown and forgotten, now grew in deliberate rows, every sapling tagged with a name not of donors or shareholders, but of survivors who had walked through fire and planted something after. The girls came and went freely. Now they laughed without apology. Some had cut their hair short. Some dyed it wild colors. Some wore scars openly, tracing them like maps across collarbones or cheeks, never hiding again. Arabella never asked them to speak about what had been taken. She asked only what they wanted to build. Dasha worked late hours, sometimes sleeping, at her desk in the East London office. Sfora's organizing transnational grants for shelters in cities Arabella had never stepped foot in. Jin had joined a tactical nonprofit, No Press Allowed. Sloane, now in glasses and boots, perpetually muddy from fieldwork, sent bi-weekly reports from training hubs in Montenegro and Georgia. The Langley estate had been reshaped, not polished, not sterilized, just repurposed. The West Wing had become the sanctuary Huban, open-floor collaboration of lawyers, archivists, medics, trauma-informed designers. River helped from a distance, funneling quiet protection through shell companies and ex-Black Ops contacts. Carver manned the gate and trained the new guards, like he was building a fortress made of vigilance and second chances. Arabella rarely sat still. Her energy had changed, not the frantic momentum of someone running from ghosts, but the grounded tempo of someone who now chose where her fire went. She was quieter now in rooms of power, but somehow more dangerous for it. She didn't raise her voice, she asked pointed questions. She didn't threaten. She made promises, and Ashton He learned to move with her, not ahead or behind. He worked on global policy initiatives by day, but by night he learned to cook lentils with cumin, to mend soil with coffee grounds, to sit in the dark beside her, and not fill the silence. They didn't wear the rings every day, but they never put them away either. One night, months after the last burn, Arabella stood by the greenhouse as rain poured in silver sheets. She tilted her head, listening not to the past or the echo of surveillance, but to the hum of water on leaves. She didn't flinch when thunder cracked. She welcomed it. Ashton joined her without speaking. She passed him a steaming mug, freshly brewed. They didn't toast. They didn't whisper romantic promises. They just stood, rain above them. Roots below and all around them, the orchard grew. The weeks passed, not in chaos, but in quiet rebuild. Arabella no longer moved like someone bracing for battle. She moved with intention, now through courtrooms where testimony cracked old legal walls, through sanctuaries where laughter echoed in hallways that once carried silence, through the foundations of systems she was determined to change. She met with ministers, not to ask, but to inform. She sat with survivors, not to extract, but to listen. She walked into global panels with no PR team, no pre-cleared speech, just truth. Ruthless, necessary, and unafraid. The Langley Halebrook Trust became more than an initiative. It became a blueprint. Licensing and policy teams built programs rooted in consent, not charity. Training modules were co-authored with survivors. Every document, every line of code, every clause carried one mandate. Dignity is non-negotiable. Donors who had once demanded naming rights were turned away. The archive had made sure of that. You either came clean or you didn't come in. Behind closed doors, some called her unreasonable. Others said she was dangerous. Arabella wore both like armor. When the World Commission on Trafficking Reform held its emergency summit in Oslo, Arabella walked into the conference hall uninvited. By the end of the day, 3 resolutions had passed with survivor-led amendments. 5 delegates resigned, and a 6th asked to join her task force. She didn't smile often in public. But when she did, it rewired rooms. Back in the orchard, the earth was soft again. Ashton had hired local school children to help with planting weekends. He said it was more honest that way. Truth wasn't legacy. It was compost. It needed work. Hands, mistakes, breath. They spent their nights in the East Wing now. No staff, just them. Arabella would curl on the floor with blueprints. Ashton at the window reading articles out loud, editing government responses with dry sarcasm and tea. Sometimes they'd argue, long and late, about strategies, about how fast or slow to go, but they never walked away angry. They were learning what it meant to fight the same war, not just love the same cause. There were still threats, anonymous letters, legal traps, hidden enemies who'd built too much off silence to let it stay broken. But Arabella had outlived that fear. She wore her story like steel now. One afternoon she sat on a bench beneath the oldest pine in the grove, a fresh envelope on her lap. It had come from a Geneva tribunal, a formal request. They wanted her to testify, done just as survivor, but as expert. Not to prove pain, but to expose policy. She didn't open it yet. She watched the girls in the field, Hope and Dasha, teaching. New arrivals, how to repot seedlings. Sloan bent over blueprints of a planned shelter in Dakar. Someone played a guitar. Someone else argued gently about compost ratios. It wasn't perfection. It was beginning. That was enough. She looked down at the envelope, then up at the clouds breaking open with light. She would testify. But not because they asked her to. Because she had something to say. ChatGPT said. Arabella stood beneath the wide canopy of the orchard. The breeze threading through her braid as she read the letter again, then folded it, slipped it into her back pocket, and didn't look back. She didn't need confirmation anymore. Her presence was the confirmation. The orchard was blooming. Survivors were writing their own curricula. The Trust's first global summit was being planned, not in Davos or Geneva, but in Lagos. That had been Dash's idea. Where the silence started, we answer it loud. The thought made Arabella smile. Not the half-curled, careful smile of a woman calculating moves, but one unguarded, real. Ashton found her hours later in the library, cross-legged on the floor beside a stack of translated depositions. She didn't look up immediately. She was highlighting something. A note left by one of the girls in the Zurich group. Justice isn't loud. It's patient and armed with memory. He crouched beside her, slid a steaming mug of coffee into her hand. She took it wordlessly, her fingers brushing his in, thanks. He didn't need to ask what she was reading anymore. He already knew. These were no longer ghost stories. They were testimonies of power reclaimed. River's flight lands tomorrow, Ashton said. Not a question. She nodded. They're assigning him to the task force advisory panel, she added, her voice even. He'll be based in Marseille, but the field team's coming through London next month. A beat. Then softly, you okay with that? Arabella met his gaze. No hesitation. I am. And she was. What she'd had with River wasn't something to erase or rewrite. It had been a chapter. One written in fire and guilt and raw survival. But the epilogue was peace. He had found his way to accountability. She had found hers to release. Outside, the wind shifted, rain coming again, soft and steady. That night, they worked late, not just on policy, but on soil maps, outreach plans, and asylum applications from 6 countries. At midnight, Arabella rested her head on Ashton's shoulder, eyes closed but not asleep. He traced circles over the back of her hand, a silent rhythm between them. I've been thinking, she murmured. We should open a secondary campus, somewhere unexpected, somewhere loud, like Palawan, she said, or Karachi. Maybe Rio? He grinned into her hair. You're thinking globally now. I was built in pieces, she replied. It's only fair I leave pieces of healing everywhere they tried to erase us. Ashton's hand stilled over hers. He kissed her temple. Outside the estate, the world was still messy, governments resisting reform. Courts slow to prosecute syndicates, new threats rising where old ones had crumbled. But inside the orchard, on land once used to broker silence, there was music now. Growth. Choice. It wasn't over, but it was theirs now. And that was how the war ended, not in a single fire, but in the steady, stubborn planting of something better. A few days later, the orchard welcomed its first cohort of international. Survivors girls from Moldova, Myanmar, Lagos, Puebla, Karachi, and Kyiv. Not guests. Not patients. Builders. Arabella stood at the threshold of the east greenhouse, watching them. Some were barefoot in the soil. One painted a mural on the walls, inner glass dandelions turning into birds. Another tuned an old guitar left behind by one of the Langley staff. They didn't need instructions, only space, and the knowledge that they were safe enough to imagine again. Ashton stepped beside her, sleeves rolled up, boots still muddy from clearing the southern trail. It's working, he said, quietly. She exhaled. It's beginning. The Trust's official launch had already rippled across the world. Governments were being forced to audit private sector contracts. Investigations reopened. Edwards' archive had led to 7 international resignations and the suspension of 3 diplomatic envoys. Arabella had testified twice already, once to the UN Subcommittee on Biogenetic Violations, and once, tearfully but clearly, in front of the Parliamentary Oversight Commission in London. The name Bellatrix had become shorthand now for fear, but for resilience born from captivity. Still, the trauma ran deep. It didn't vanish because of tribunals or headlines. That was why they'd built this place. Arabella and Ashton walked slowly through the orchard rows of rosepal trees. Wild jasmine and creeping vines of passion fruit now trained along reclaimed fencing. A few girls passed them on bikes, laughing, wind whipping through hair that had once been shaved for compliance. Arabella smiled at each of them, naming them silently as she passed. Aaliyah, Noor, Victoria, May, Tara, Ishrat. They weren't numbers anymore. Later, in the main lodge, Arabella sat before a fire with Dasha and Jin, drawing out plans for the Trust's mobile outreach van. No uniforms, Dasha insisted, her accent still thick. We wear what they wear, so they don't feel inspected. And no translators from the system, Jin added. We use survivor interpreters. Arabella nodded, noting every word. And meals first, not interviews. The girls exchanged a look. A private code. Arabella smiled. Exactly. At night the lodge was quiet. Arabella wandered the halls in socks and a thick cardigan, passing rooms with soft laughter behind the doors. Ashton found her near the kitchen, nursing a mug of mint tea. You've been walking a lot lately, he said. She shrugged. I don't sleep like I used to. He studied her. That's not always a bad thing. She smiled faintly. No, it's not. They walked to the West Wing together. It had once been Langley's boardroom mahogany, vaulted ceilings, brass chandeliers. Now it held books, plants, old pillows, a swing chair. On one wall, a massive collage built from shredded Bellatrix files declassified, unredacted, sewn together by the girls and then painted over with wild colors. A phoenix rose from the center mid-flight, wings stitched from fragments of names once used against them. Arabella stood before it, silent. This isn't a monument, she murmured. Ashton tilted his head. It's a warning, she said, to every architect who thinks control will last longer than memory. Ashton took her hand, pulled her gently to the window. Outside, dawn was breaking across the orchard, and for the first time in her life, Arabella didn't brace for what was coming next. She welcomed it,